Welcome to the Lloyd's List podcast. I'm Michelle Vesey-Bockman, Principal Analyst, Lloyd's List Intelligence. You're listening to this week's podcast, courtesy of our sponsor, Lloyd's Register. You have to be a cold bitch or an easy lay. Those wonderful words of advice were given nearly 50 years ago by the boss of a London-based shipping company to a young woman starting out her maritime career. That young woman went on to become one of the three founders of the Women's International Shipping and Trading Association, known as Wista. And thankfully, she realised she had other choices to be successful. But I'm recounting that story because for the last 3 years, May 18 is now assigned as the International Day for Women in Maritime by the International Maritime Organization. And that's going to be the theme of today's podcast. But first, does the international shipping community even need such a day, I hear you ask? I put that question to Karine Langlois, the IMO's social media and communications officer.
Karine, imagine that I'm a middle-aged white male working in a senior management position in shipping. Tell me why there needs to be an International Day for Women in Maritime.
So obviously the world is made up of, nowadays we don't always see two genders, but a large pool of women which have skills and strength and different perspective and different angles to bring to the table, which has been overlooked for a long time. And there's been many studies now, it's not even up for debate, that having diversity at the table just makes business sense, economic sense, just makes common sense. And that's why the maritime sector is not excluded from that. And we might have been a little bit slow to respond to that trend, but finally we are making big changes. And certainly at the IMO, we are embracing that trend. And that's why Women in Maritime Day allows us to focus and to focus on all the work that has been brought from women in all the sectors of the maritime world. And it allows us to, put their voice to the front.
How far behind, quote unquote, do you think the maritime sector is compared to, say, other professions, comparable professions?
I think it depends which sector of the maritime world. Of course, if we're talking about seafaring, for example, it is still quite far behind. We're talking in terms of, 2 to 3% maybe, and that's being generous. There are in some countries still cultural barriers and traditional barriers which prevents women to be away from her family for a long period of time, which is what seafarers face, men and women. They are at sea for months and months. So in that sector, it is still quite far behind. But in other ones, there's been some tremendous changes. And I really do believe that technology, for example, is playing a role, because some of the sectors which used to be seen as labor-oriented or, where it was more like manly strength that were required, those things are changed now and replaced by technology and AI. And these are fields where women are clearly embracing and being very good at. So I have hope that with this, women will take these positions as it comes into our sector.
Next, I'd like to introduce to the podcast Anna Robinson, partner at London law firm Watson, Farley and Williams. She's the co-head of employment and immigration practice there and works across insurance, aviation, energy and shipping, among other sectors.
Let's talk about, first of all, female representation in the maritime industry. Yes. Because let's get the figures out there, because the legal profession is probably the best represented, but it varies.
It does vary, and it varies massively, of course, between onshore roles and offshore roles. I think at Watson Farley and legal profession more generally, we've got fantastic female representation because the law appeals to students and university graduates, and then they enter the firm not necessarily knowing that they'll be interested in maritime, but they have a couple of seats, they go abroad, and suddenly they're very inspired and passionate about it. So I think, as you say, we're doing very well in the legal sector, but there's a huge amount of work to do in other onshore professions. And when you look at offshore roles, it's still incredibly low at around 7%. So that's the nub of it, because it will in time, in fact it's already creating an issue in terms of labour shortages. So we've really got to think about how to tap into 50% of the talent pool.
And also a lot of the offshore roles, when they come ashore, go into technical management, and of course that just perpetuates the gender imbalance.
Absolutely. And when you look at the targets which the International Chamber of Shipping advocates, they're very conservative, which I think highlights the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
You know, in 3 years they're looking at 12%. In 20 years we're still only looking at 25%. So to me that's very interesting, but I think it's right that they are realistic targets. And I think it's right to recognise there is no silver bullet. This is a long-term issue, but the important point is that it needs to stay on the agenda for change. You know, it can't just be a fashionable topic across 3 or 5 years. We've got to keep the conversation going, which is why it's brilliant that we're having this discussion today.
My opinion is that there's an inherent sexism at the top as well that we have to deal with.
Yeah, there's definitely more to do at leadership level, for sure. I think it's women are reasonably well represented in the UK, but I think internationally certainly there's more to do. And men as well as women need to be brave enough to talk about it. I do think when it comes to discrimination issues, there is a bit of nervousness about saying the wrong thing because it's so sensitive.
Yeah.
But we can't shy away from the conversation. I think leaders need to be brave enough to tackle it, because that message obviously needs to come from the top and needs to be taken seriously. But what's really encouraging is that when we got our Sustainability Imperative report, we published the second volume last year, gender diversity, including board composition, featured as one of the most important topics facing the industry. You know, and that's taking into account sustainability and environmental issues. You know, it's up there. So I do think there is a genuine desire to change.
That desire for change can be seen in many ways. A year ago, I interviewed for this podcast the chief executive of listed ship owner Navigator Gas, Mads Peter Zacco, about a diversity-linked loan. It was a relatively new idea back then. The company aimed to deal with shipping shortcomings by linking a $200 million loan facility to ambitious targets to increase the level of senior women in management. They were hoping to reach 35% within 5 years from the current level then of 16%. This is what he said on the podcast in May last year.
It's a relatively steep incline that we have ahead of us, and that means that we need to work very diligently on this. We've also set the target at 22% for this year, so ramping it up from around 16 to 22% within a year. That you can imagine that's a lot of work to do, and we need to be successful on this one. At this point in time, we do not have any women in the C team, and that of course also is an aim to change over time.
The maritime industry is facing a pivotal challenge: decarbonising the existing fleet. To address this, Lloyd's Register has been evaluating what this means for shipping stakeholders. Lloyd's Register's Engine Retrofit Report provides a comprehensive overview of fleet and technology readiness to transition to alternative fuels, including methanol and ammonia. This report considers the primary regulatory drivers, shipyard retrofit capacity and capability, as well as the importance of human factors and training. You can download the report at www.lr.org/ERR.
Navigator Gas released their ESG report a few weeks back, and they've already smashed their interim target with 28% women in shore-based leadership positions and 30 female seagoing employees. I asked Anna Robinson about whether these sorts of targets were now more widespread.
Well, it's not just a case of doing the right thing because morally it's a nice thing to do. There is absolutely a financial imperative. And I would say there's a real cost in not doing anything, because we have this war for talent, which will only get worse with time. That has an impact on wages. And of course, when you look at the lenders, they're asking for these statistics. They want to know diversity composition. They're asking for KPIs on diversity and representation of women. So the business case, the financial drivers are front and centre. And I think there is an understanding now that it's an issue that needs tackling.
And Karine at the IMO has also seen some progress.
Even just with my own observation, being at IMO for well over a decade now, the parity in the delegations that come to the IMO meetings have far more women in them. We used sometimes to see, and even for more technical meetings, we used to see men-only delegations. And now you see sometimes even entire delegations represented by women. So that is definitely a positive change, even for us here at the IMO. And we can also see from our academic institution, the World Maritime University and the International Maritime Law Institute, that there's more women applicants, more women taking up postgraduate studies to then go back to their country and have positions of leadership roles. So there's definitely some trends that are positive in some areas.
Everybody that I talked to while researching this podcast agreed that getting more women into shipping started from the beginning.
The reality of the legislative framework being different, but also, of course, there are cultural differences.
Absolutely.
And in some countries, it just won't be seen as a respectable profession, in inverted commas, because it's not the done thing for women to do. And that's the challenge. You know, we're not dealing with one set of values and one Equality Act. Everybody's progressing at a different pace. So it is a difficult problem to solve.
Yes, the challenges of being an international industry. And everything happening globally.
Yeah, because look, even when you look at the Equality Act in the UK and compare it to equivalent equality legislation in Europe, even across Europe there will be changes. So if you're trying, for example, to define what we mean by harassment, we're all starting from different points. So, you know, in some countries, harassment might mean violence, physical violence. In the UK, we don't go as far as that. We talk about creation of a hostile or degrading environment. So there's different perspectives on what the language means. So as a lawyer crafting the legislative framework, it's really quite difficult and challenging, I think, to find a common ground. A big issue which needs looking at, I think, particularly for offshore roles, is the question of maternity leave, maternity pay, lengths of contracts, and those other family-friendly rights and provisions to enable women to have family responsibilities if they want to. Not everybody will want to, but it's about presenting that option. And it's also about investing in women in the long term. You know, I've got 2 kids, I took 2 years out, but the firm recognises that that's just one part of my career, and my personal circumstances will evolve, and my role at the firm will evolve with it. And they've invested in me in the long term, and it's that long-term view, I think, not discounting women because you think, oh, well, they're not going to be around in 2 years because they'll take maternity leave. Well, that's only a short period of time when you look at somebody's entire career span. But I do think those family-friendly rights are really key, actually, in changing the conversation around on offshore roles and getting the percentages up.
Now, Lloyd's List interviewed Australia's first marine female engineer a couple of weeks ago. We're just going to insert her experiences in that area.
I told the company straight away because I thought it important that they understood that I was pregnant, yet I still wanted to work. I got a medical approval from a marine doctor, a maritime doctor, that I could work. His only stipulation was that I didn't lift over a certain amount of weight.
Fair enough.
And because I hadn't lifted that amount of weight, I thought there wouldn't be any problems. It was problematic for other people, not for me. So I went back to work. I only managed to complete that swing before I was told that I wasn't really welcome back on the ship. They tried to give me a position in the office, which was over a 3-hour drive away for me, there and back. So 3 hours there, 3 hours back. I was quite happy to do that. I just, did as I was told. I did that for a while. They still weren't happy that I was working and I was pregnant. So they decided not to give me a job, to give me work while I was pregnant. So I had my entire pregnancy at home.
We've heard what Stephanie had to say. If I take the other view, I would say, well, how on earth can we have a female with family responsibilities at sea when, that's just not practical or feasible? Do you think that's a fair argument to make?
I think it's difficult, and I think the idea that just creating a diversity and inclusion policy and sticking it in a staff manual, the idea that in itself is sufficient is clearly wrong. There needs to be training and education at all levels and a cultural change on board vessels, and that's difficult and it takes time. But I know from my experience of other sectors, because I have the advantage of working in different across different sectors, that that change can happen. But it has to comes back to what we were saying earlier. It has to come from the top down. But of course, it can be intimidating if you're the only woman in that male-dominated environment. I can completely understand how it felt isolating. And there's lots of really good work being done in the mental health space, as you'll know. And I think a lot of those messages and initiatives will help women, the idea of combating loneliness and isolation, because I think it particularly affects females in offshore roles, because naturally they will feel more isolated, particularly if there's banter or certain types of male behaviour which makes them feel excluded from a group.
And also, we would probably be talking about groups where they have been exclusively all men for probably many, many years in their career. I mean, I'm not offering that as an excuse, but it's a reality. So, everyone has to change. I mean, I don't think I could go into that environment and work. So I think it would take a very brave and particular type of woman that wanted to have a career in that area. But, there's just, when you start talking about it, there's just so many different strings that you have to consider.
But doesn't that make them a fantastic candidate for the job if they've got that level of passion and commitment, So I think anybody that wants to do it, who is in that position, great, give them the opportunity, because I'm sure they will do absolutely fantastically.
There's also change afoot at the IMO Secretariat, which hasn't always been noted as the most progressive of organisations in the past.
Certainly at the moment, the senior committee, the senior management committee, is 50-50 under our new leader, the Secretary General Dominguez. He has 50-50 on his advisory board, which is brilliant. For the rest of the organization, it's not quite there, although I think it's in his agenda to try to bridge that gap. There are definitely more women in senior managerial role. Certainly in my division, our director is a woman, director of legal affairs, my immediate head as well. So definitely we've seen some positive change within the Secretariat.
So there you have it. Baby steps, but we're moving forward. And can I just give a shout out for the Speakers Bureau that the IMO and Wista have put together for all of those looking for women to speak at conferences. If we want to attract more women in shipping, we're not showing our best face if all the major shipping conferences are full of middle-aged white men talking. So please check it out. And a shout out again to our podcast sponsors, Lloyd's Register. Thank you for your support, Lloyd's Register.